Hello everybody, what's up? It's Booksy. Today is Wednesday, December 13th. We'll be talking about AMC stock, a little bit about ChargePoint maybe for a minute. And I will talk about SPY a bit. I'm not going to talk necessarily about what we just experienced, which was a pretty massive break of the widening. You see how it broke out of this widening. That was a really strong breakout, and it was really a long way up to the widening, and then it broke out. So it's a pretty huge move to the upside after the FOMC meeting, and we saw something similar happen with the buy-in on AMC. Although this is still a question mark. We'll talk about that. Basically, yesterday during the live stream, which I know like people come on and off of there, I get maybe a few hundred views overall, but I usually only average about 50 or 60 to 100 people at a time at the most, usually. And so I'm not going to assume that most of you saw that. I'm going to have to kind of go back through it a little bit. But the long story short is, a lot of times when we see what I have dubbed the cat ears, people tend to get really nervous. And I think there's good reason for that, because oftentimes that cat ear can result in a distribution. So a cat ear, when I describe it, it has this really specific cat-like shape. Usually starts with like a paw, right? I'm going to make this really bold for a second. And the paw is kind of like an initial high. And then these really represent ultimately a UT and a UTAD typically in the cat ear structure. If it's structured in a way where it's, going to be distribution, that's what happens. But something special happens when that doesn't pan out, which is basically when the final cat ear drops, you have what I would call like a creek. I would maybe describe it as a bit of a bearish creek, because if you jump it and you reverse and you end up hooking here, you end up dropping. And this is a part of the cat ear that I think I know it goes without saying, and I've been talking about this for like 2 years, and it's kind of silly, this analogy that I have. But it's one that's really important, and that is the final action of the cat ear, and it's usually this, which is that you come up, you create an LSPY, right? And this is kind of where you end up with, so you have some kind of weakness in the beginning of the range, and you got the UT, UTAD, then you get the LSPY, which almost always presents itself as like a hook. And if I were going to describe where that hook goes, I would say it goes right along this line right here. So the trend that you have on the cat ear going up, and this is nothing new. This is something, again, kind of like talked about it a lot. I use the word hook because it, to me, reminds me of like a fishing hook, where it comes up and then drops. If you had flipped this upside down, you'd probably look at this and say, well, it's just a confirmation, right, of a creek jump. And it is, but it's going the bearish direction. Does that make sense? And normally if we saw something like this, we would call it a jump over the creek. That's what happens in that bear scenario, is that you get a jump over the creek and then it rejects on the creek. But as you can see here, that's not what happened on SPY. Even though it got the cat ear, it looked like a weaker second top in some ways. I mean, there's definitely arguments that you could make about this coming up above this particular point twice and selling back down, and then what seemed to be a sell through, right? Then reverses. And this is where things get kind of interesting, because on the whole, we knew this was like a widening. You can see the spread is widening pretty greatly. So there's a lot of selling happening into the buying, which is causing the drops to become bigger and bigger. The runs are being bigger too. So you got a lot of trading going on in this area. And this is why it becomes such a bullish breakout, because if it's widening, usually that signals reversal, but an exhaustion of the sellers and it causing then the stock to go back to the upside, that's a big deal. It's a very bullish pattern for kind of a top. So anytime SPY makes a widening on a top, usually pretty darn bullish. And I mentioned that previously when talking about my thoughts on whether this would reverse, and I kept saying that, like, look, if it doesn't reverse and go down, then this is going to be really, really bullish, because, and it was, but it is because typically this is only seen in this kind of hyper bullish scenario. So what else is interesting though is that AMC was actually doing the same thing, and it's doing it on like a slight delay. So if you look at the entry points here, basically we have a drop in for AMC and we have a rise up. And this is what begins that widening process. And you can see on the chart that they look basically the same. Now I know my charts are a bit messy. I tried to clean them up a little bit. But I want you to notice like the first push up, the second push up, first push up, second push up, and then the cat ear structure that I just showed you on SPY and how it's present right here as well. And then when we notice is that on SPY, even if you go to the extended hours, so right now I've got a bit of a asynchronization right here because I've got no extended hours on for the S&P. But you can see that on the S&P, when it came back down, it actually did break what we would consider to be that trend line right here. I mean, there's not any other way to really draw it. This is the last hit on it before that push down. And then if you look back even further, you can kind of tell that this was like an ascending right here as well. And it seems to have broken through that, tested it. And, you know, obviously we see the M shape here, but it's more than that. It's a liquidity test, and then it immediately makes a huge recovery and then a higher low, and then it just continues on. And this is the kind of situation that doesn't occur super often when you see a cat ear setup, but it does happen, and it's what I would call like a spring. And in this case, you can see that this looks like a rise. I would say it's a sign of strength, like a sign of continuation. There's a massive buy-in here. And then you have basically, if you're paying attention, if you're not sure what I'm talking about when I say this, there's a double M shape right here. So there's two up thrusts, and then there's another M with two up thrusts, and then it drops. And this is really typical of an iterative function. So it's basically iterating the same thing we see here, but it's doing it really small, which tells me that this could be a reaccumulation, right, after a decline, which is bizarre because it's happening in what seems to be like the middle of the range. Another way we might put this is there's an SOS with a backup, and an SOS meaning a sign of strength, and then basically we're backing up to the creek, and you can see I've drawn it with this kind of under arc here, and it stays pretty strong, and it doesn't ever break the creek again. And then, you know, in the local range, you can see this arcing shape. And this should look really familiar if you've been watching the patterns lately, because we had something really similar to this occur back in September, October on AMC, where you basically have a low, then you make a slightly higher low, and then you come back down after the M cross to make a new bottom. And that's right here. So you make a low, and you make a slightly lower low, or a higher low, and then you come up. This is your main M cross, has jumped a little creek. And then you come back down to test the creek, and while doing that, this actually makes a lower low. That's a spring action, and then you get a big buy-in right here. That starts it off, and then you get an LPS, which jumps the main creek, and then basically you go up into the SOS way up here, and then you get a bigger buy-in. All of that buying is happening on the way up, and naturally you can see it. You don't need to tell you everything, but you can see that first M shape, and you can see this results in kind of a secondary M cross here. And it makes sense. You know, each of these are being tested, you know, as it goes up. It's finding support on the next one, and you get those waves. But it starts right here, right? And I would even argue that you probably would draw it down this way, but it doesn't really matter. You get the point. This particular motion, though, all happens high in the range, higher, I suppose I could say. And it's basically like a reaction, an auto reaction with a decline that then turns into a reaccumulation range. And this area doesn't end up becoming bearish. But again, it could have. And I think that it's kind of obvious when you look back on it, because you can see, I mean, you literally can see it break through. There's no way to draw it where it doesn't break through that uptrend. And this is kind of like the critical moment, right? Right here, where if this had gone through and hooked, we would be singing a very different tune right now, right? Because this would completely change this entire setup. So the nature of this breakdown here is, again, very similar to what we see over here, very similar in terms of that push up, the double cat ear. These obviously set up lower than this top did, which again puts you in a position where your SOS is in a different spot maybe, but otherwise, it's basically the same. You still see that double M on the bottom here. These are going down. This is rising, right? And that's kind of all all you need to say, right? That's it. It's a good comparison when you're talking about the way a range might set up and how it can appear to be a bit bearish, right, in a spring-like action. And in this case, it doesn't even come below the previous bottom. It only comes below the bottom right here, which was, again, December 4th. So fast forward to where we are now. And again, it might be kind of like, well, why does that apply right now? Well, again, I did the one-to-one comparison on stream, and I didn't do it based on just bars pattern, because bars pattern makes it look identical. You have to then look at, okay, well, what is this hitting right here, right? Like, what's this distributing over? And you can see, like, it's distributing over that first, we would call it like a first buying climax here, but like on this particular one, it looks like more like an auto reaction. Point is that the levels that are being set up are set up the same way. And then how it's traversing those levels, it's actually doing them, again, in much the same way. There are some minor differences here. One is that you can see this kind of almost head and shoulder like, if this were like the head, for example, almost head and shoulder like appearance here on this setup where you've got kind of shoulder one, head, shoulder two. These are rising, these are falling. Now, even in this spike up to the top, I don't believe it came higher. I think it came lower. Yeah, just slightly. And that's important, right? Because we know that this particular line is one that is going to cause us some issues if we don't get over it, right? We've been talking about coming back up to 730, and we need to get back over that level. Otherwise, yeah, it could be straight up distributive. This could be an S-curve continuation downward. A lot of people are going to be talking about that S-curve going into this weekend. I think that's kind of where the rubber meets the road for us right now, because they're not wrong. The bears aren't wrong. If this ends up distributing from here, if this is a hook, and it can't recapture the top here, even after this massive buy-in that occurred, you could be running into some trouble. Now, when I look at this, and I think about this going all the way to the top and then all the way back to the bottom, I do often think about this in terms of a distribution, because I'm like, well, it keeps pushing up and it keeps coming up high, but this didn't come up too high. And then you can say, well, maybe it's just kind of like a LSPY and then it dropped down. But I saw the same thing happening, and I drew it out, and you can see what I mean. This looks like a smaller iteration. You can see the widening that's occurring. It really looks like a smaller iteration of what we see over here, and that typically happens in a cat ear, as you get that sequence build out again towards the right ear. And that's often why this right ear can look kind of chunky and weird, because you get that whole sequence build out. So it just depends on the way the sequence is. And I think you see the same thing applies here. It's just, in this case, it looks a little different. It's a little sharper, right? But I think we got the exact same overall feel. And I'm looking at this red marker, and I said on the stream that we're probably going to come down, and I haven't moved this, just so you guys know. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if people are dishonest about that kind of stuff, but I'm trying to be as straightforward as I can. I haven't moved this since the stream. And what I did is I took this and I went from here up to the top. And what I did is I took a 50% intersection. So it's 50% of the height, 50% of the width. And you can see it's right there. So again, just to show that like I haven't moved it, that's right where I said, you know, that 50% would be. And this is one thing that you can often do that sometimes works out really well. This one also has like the same deal right at the 50% marker. I know it's hard to see on the screen probably right now, but same deal. That 50% marker kind of defines how low it may go. I drew the arc just like we have here. I didn't expect it to go below like 660. I was hoping it would stay high. I actually hoped that this morning we would see that bounce and make a higher low and then head back up. Is it starting to look a lot like this? But I will say this, it does have a lot of the same vibes as these two, this particular drop here, and then this one in reverse. And that kind of makes sense to me. If you look at the top here, you look at the top here, that this would be somewhat similar. Isn't that unusual? Especially we're talking about kind of mirroring out that head and shoulder. So the main thing here is like, well, this is different though, Booksy, because it's going down. And I agree, it is different. And I think that that weakness would be apparent if we did come up to 845, that we haven't actually made any higher highs. SPY is on a tear, right? The S&P is on a tear. And I don't think that that necessarily applies to us. We might get up to that 845 level, which was my target, and we've been talking about it for a while. I've been saying 860, I've said 820. It's in the middle, right? It's about 845. And that is where this widening goes. And I did another kind of stretched analysis of this, and we looked at this particular kind of setup and where this would need to go. And I looked at this, drew it out yesterday. I'm not going to go into high detail about this right now. Suffice to say, it's pretty straightforward. You need to come up and create an M-shaped cross here over the creek, which ultimately puts you on top of this particular downtrend. Now I'm going to stop doing the comparison, because I want to just talk really quick about this setup. I don't have RSI up, but it is very oversold on a lot of time frames. There's a lot of buy signals on my RSI indicator all the way up to an hour, and that's typically pretty bullish. We had a divergence that seemed to kind of go away today a little bit, so that's kind of a bummer because, again, we made that lower low. But otherwise, this to me still looks like, a lot of this still looks like a symmetry build out from this side over to this side. And I can see how, if you count it out and you look at where these landings are, I know it's low. It could be very well that this ends up building out and going out the same way. I did the analysis a couple different ways and basically got some decent pointers on where we might be coming down and possibly reversing, but I don't want to get into this one too much. It's a sine wave that's symmetrical, and I think there's a lot of symmetry coming out here and out here. And I think if we were to go straight to 14 now instead of going low first, we probably would follow this path right here, right on up, and it would be roughly the same angle as this one, but we would come up to like the 1030 area, 1073 area, and then push up higher, right, to this 1440s area. And all of that would happen by like mid-January or something like that, like about a month. I know that's a bit of a stretch, and I still think we're not necessarily out of the woods yet. We are still at risk because even though today's price action was pretty darn close to what we drew yesterday on stream, and talking about, that movement, it did not do everything that we would want it to do. So here's where I'm going to get with this. So first, it spent most of the day, and I had kind of plotted that maybe, again, like that 665 area might be the low. You can see it came much lower than that, obviously. Broke down, made a new low, new all-time low, So I had this mapped out. This ended up being pretty darn close to what happened early in the day, but not later in the day, okay? And then I anticipated that if we were going to do any kind of a hook, that we would basically have to use this and this because these are the last 2 points, right, that we have. Now, I'm kind of estimating where it is right there, but I think it's pretty darn close. You see what the issue is that we basically landed right on it at the end of the day. So they kept it a little bit ambiguous. And notice that here, it does have that backup right along that creek. Like it rejects, comes back down and finds support, and then it pushes up again, and you get that leap. We didn't quite do the same thing. And I know that I've got the RSI on here. The 30-minute looks like a rejection. The 15-minute, it's kind of like sitting right underneath it. It kind of peaked above it, went above it for a second, and then came right underneath it. SPY, when it did this reversal, it actually jumps over it, and it comes back down through it again later, potentially to check that floor again, probably amongst other things. But again, here's where the rub is, right? Is it basically ended the day right on that 681. That's been a very common place for us lately to find support. We have found at different times a little bit of rejection there. You can see back here on the 28th. You can see that, yes, this morning, the 13th. And then even when we were coming in, you can see a little bit of a squiggle right there on the November 21st. But largely, it's been support. So we really are not out of the woods yet. We need to get above 681. And then I'd like to see it push up and go check this creek. We may not get there this week because we're going into Friday. I could definitely see it camping out at 7 if we happen to get up above here. I know that max pain was set at 650, so a lot of people are going to be saying, no, it's going to come right back down. We're going to go down to 650. Look, it's not out of the question that happens. But I will say this. Even if that did happen, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to end the week at 650 just if it comes back down tomorrow, because if it makes a higher low, or if it reconfirms this bottom here, which is at like 653, this could be a spring action with a test, right? And it could still have a pretty violent reaction again. So I know we're a little too early to celebrate. We're not there yet. 657 seemed pretty reasonable. With any luck, we can get a 750 finish this week, but I think it would have to move pretty darn fast. And we would definitely need to make this jump, make a push against resistance here, and then probably come back down, retest that creek. I could see that happening into a Friday and then ending the day, going into Monday, right around 7, so come down and bounce. Seems about right to me. It just depends on the velocity. It looks a lot like what you see here, but it's not by accident. I think it's just the nature of this setup, that you would have this jump, push resistance, come back down to check, make sure we're not going to go back down through this guy, and then do it again. And at that point, you're looking at, we'd be heading up for like that SOS kind of area. So going into Monday, Tuesday, if this can remain a little bit bullish, we should see that. On the other hand, there was this kind of tracking that occurred midday today where it really followed that bear path like almost perfectly. I mean, it was such a misdirection. All day I was like, I don't know. This is quite literally, again, what I drew yesterday. I didn't change it. I said, if this drops down and hooks here and then drops again and it hooks here, you can be in a bad situation, So we're still at risk of that larger retest right here being some kind of just up thrust, and then it just sells off violently. And we end up looking back on this and being like, well, it was just a hook that just went too far, as opposed to a hook that broke back above. So they left it very, I think, purposely open. And I do think that's going to cause a little bit of confusion going into tomorrow, maybe Friday. We'll see how it plays out. But it's definitely like right on the edge. So I think that's by design. And if that were to occur, and for some reason we did come back down and we hook beneath that 654 area, I think it's likely that we're going to at least get down to the 630s, and then beyond that, honest to goodness, I think we probably just start selling off and head down towards 490. I can't imagine why it would come that low and just not go for it, And I know what y'all are thinking, like, well, if it's spring, it could go down there and reaccumulate. Well, maybe, but again, that would be like that 630 pocket. I just can't see it going much lower than that without some serious sell-off. You see this creek line right here. It's really important, and I think that it represents the initial downtrend here. And I could imagine if we go back down to it, we could bounce along it. But once it gets through there, it's going to slide like hardcore. This would be a whole fake breakout with no hope. So I think that right now, it's possible based on the way this traversed that this looks like a spring, because notice that in the local area, it breached both this bottom here on this widening, which we said was a smaller iteration, and then the larger one, which means that both of those technically could have a checkbox in my mind. And then when I look at them, I see this is coming back up, and notice that it closed back inside of this particular range. So it went down low, broke through this range right here, this widening, dropped, reversed, and then it closed back inside of this little like mini range right here. So I think it's got some teeth to it that this could be a really strong reaccumulation. Again, I know that it went lower than expected. It was following that bear pattern, from about midday on. Definitely didn't look great. But ended the day with this closing back up. And I haven't looked at the daily, but I'm sure it's a decent candle. I would imagine it looks a little bit like since we closed above, I imagine it looks like a bull hammer. Because we closed, can't remember where we opened, but I think we closed. Okay, now, well, it went a little too high, so it didn't quite end with that hammer look, but it ended high. So that's kind of a bummer, but anyway, it's a pretty good move. So, oh well for that. Definitely looks like a strong amount of volume came into that bottom, which, if it's distribution, most of the time your high volume is in those tops, not the bottoms. So you don't usually get that buy-in. We'll see. So tomorrow, what am I looking for? What's kind of the basic bottom line here? I've already said it in maybe too many words. this can't be just like a distributive top that then just slides and we hook here. So I think if we come down tomorrow and we end up hooking around 653 or 650 area, it's not going to be good. However, based on where it closed, based on that buy-in, based on the setup, if it can manage to hold, even with a back test that maybe comes down low and then comes back up, because remember, there's always more than one story here, and one of them is going to be this, right? That it did jump this particular trend. So that's one. And I also think jumped this trend. So that's two. So there's definitely a couple different back tests that could happen if it does pull back down. But if we were able to get back above and find support above that 681 area and specifically up here around 690, I think we're going to have a pretty good chance again of that continuation back to the upside. And yeah, I don't necessarily think 14 is going to happen right away. That's not what I'm saying. I still think that there's a decent chance that we could come up into mid or late December, I should say, because now it is mid-December, late December up here, and then still sell off. So we have to be mindful that it's not over, right? And then, of course, the reverse of that would be the bearish situation. So those are my targets for tomorrow into Friday. Probably not going to do another video until the end of the week, but it doesn't look awesome. This kind of reversal here doesn't look awesome when you kind of look at the basics of it. Maybe on the 30-minute, it looks like it just came up and rejected the EMA, or someone's going to say it's like a head and shoulder falling, or this is a head and shoulder and it broke down, but it reversed. I mean, that's the thing. That's the thing about springs, is that they dip down below the bottom and then they have a high volume reversal and they close back in the range. I think that's a strong sign that there could be a buy-in imminent. We'll see where smart money puts their money, I guess. Usually say put your money where your mouth is, but that setup could mean that we're heading back up, and I think that's good. I mean, those are the targets we had all along. It's taken way longer to get there, not been pleasant, but it would be nice to get some relief going into the holiday. Anyways, that's all I got for you. Hope you guys have a good one. We'll talk to you later.